The King's Inheritance. A My Hero Academia fan series. Act 5, Hiryu's Patience. Chapter 35, Hiryu's Patience. Hiryu Rin approached most things in life the way he approached his own quirk, with the patient methodical attention of someone who understood that real strength accumulated rather than appeared, and that the appearance of sudden strength in others was almost always the visible tip of a long invisible process of preparation that had simply not been witnessed by the people now admiring the result. His quirk allowed him to harden and enlarge parts of his body in a manner reminiscent of dragon scales, a quirk that had obvious aesthetic drama and that he had, over the course of his time at UA, worked to ensure was not only dramatic but precise, refining the specific points of his body where the transformation produced maximum tactical value and minimizing the energy cost of the parts that did not. Izuku had studied his quirk since November with the specific fascination he reserved for transformations that had a clear biological logic, and the two of them had developed, over the months, the kind of mutual respect that grows between people who recognize in each other the same underlying orientation toward improvement, the same willingness to do the unglamorous repetitive work that produced the glamorous results other people saw. They had never had an extended personal conversation before March. Not because of any distance between them but because their interactions had always been efficient, focused on the work, satisfying in the specific way that productive collaboration is satisfying without requiring the additional layer of personal disclosure to feel complete. It was Rin who initiated the personal conversation, on a Saturday afternoon in late March when they were both in the equipment room after a joint training session, racking weights and rinsing protective gear in the unhurried way of people whose session had gone well and who were not in a rush to leave the satisfaction of that behind. Midoriya, he said. Can I ask you something direct? Always, Izuku said. I have been watching what has been happening in the class since the autumn, Rin said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words deliberately. I have not commented on it because it was not my business until it became my business. I think it has become my business now. Izuku set down the weight he was racking. Go ahead. I find that I have developed feelings for you, Rin said, with the same directness he applied to discussing training methodology. I do not say this lightly. I have examined it the way I examine everything, by testing it against time and against scrutiny, and it is held for several months now. I am not someone who acts on things that have not been tested. Izuku looked at him. He had not, in all his observations since October, considered that Rin's feelings might run in this direction, not because anything about Rin made it implausible, but because Rin communicated almost entirely through the register of training and improvement and Izuku had not extended his observation into the personal layer underneath. I did not see this, Izuku said honestly. And I want to be honest that I did not see it, rather than pretend I had already understood and was simply waiting for you to say it. I would have been concerned if you had seen it, Rin said. I am not expressive in ways that broadcast easily. I have made my peace with that about myself a long time ago. He continued rinsing the gear with the same unhurried care. I am not asking you to feel the same thing. I am telling you what is true for me because I believe in testing things against open air rather than letting them remain private and untested. A feeling that cannot survive being spoken is not one I trust. Izuku considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Can I think about it honestly, rather than respond immediately? He said. I want to give you a true answer rather than a fast one. That is exactly the answer I would have wanted, Rin said. I do not trust fast answers either. Izuku spent the following week thinking about it in the deliberate way he had thought about each of the others, watching Rin with the renewed attention of someone correcting for an earlier gap in observation, and what he found, watching more carefully, was a person whose steadiness he had always respected professionally and that he now recognized, looking through the new lens Rin had given him, as something that extended into a steadiness of character that he found, once he was looking for it, genuinely moving. The patience in training was not a tactic. It was who Rin was, all the way through, and the consistency of it, once Izuku examined it personally rather than professionally, had the same quality of trustworthiness that he valued in Kodai and the same quality of unshowy depth that he valued in Yanagi. He found Rin in the equipment room again the following Saturday, by design this time rather than coincidence. I thought about it honestly, Izuku said. The way you asked me to. And? Rin said, with the same patient directness. I think what I feel, now that I have looked properly, is real, Izuku said. It is built on the respect I have had for you since November, and on what I am seeing now that I am looking past the training context into the person underneath it. I do not think it has the same shape as some of what I have found with others in this class. It is quieter. But quiet does not mean lesser. I think it is exactly the right size for what it is, which is something built slowly and tested honestly, the way you build everything. Rin was quiet for a moment, processing this with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. That is a fair and accurate answer, he said. I did not need it to be large. I needed it to be true. It's true, Izuku said. Then I am satisfied, Rin said, and there was, in the way he said it, a depth of quiet contentment that Izuku recognized as significant precisely because Rin so rarely allowed himself visible displays of feeling, which made the visible ones, when they appeared, weigh considerably more than they would in someone more expressive. They finished racking the equipment together in the comfortable quiet that had always characterized their work, and the quiet now had the additional layer underneath it, settled and real. And Izuku thought that this was perhaps one of the more instructive lessons of the entire year, that some of the most significant things did not arrive with drama but simply accumulated, patiently, the way Rin's own quirk accumulated, until one day they were simply and undeniably there. Chapter 36, Juzo's Honesty. Juzo Hananuki had a quality that Izuku had come to specifically respect over the months, which was an almost complete absence of pretense. His quirk allowed him to soften any organic matter he touched, a capability with obvious and considerable destructive potential that he had, since his earliest days at UA, committed to using only in carefully bounded and constructive ways, a commitment Izuku found himself thinking about often because it represented a form of restraint that was, in its quiet way, one of the more impressive things he had observed in any of his classmates. Hananuki did not perform restraint as a virtue. He simply exercised it, consistently, without commentary, in the way that people whose character runs deep do not need to announce the depth, because the depth shows in the pattern of choices rather than in the description of the choices. Izuku had trained with him twice during the rotation cycles and had come away from both sessions with the specific appreciation that comes from working alongside someone whose capability vastly exceeded what they chose to deploy, and who deployed exactly what was needed and nothing beyond it, which was a form of precision that Izuku associated with the most mature hero work he had studied. They had their honest conversation in April, in the quiet of the early evening after a joint training session, sitting on the steps outside the equipment block while the spring evening settled into its particular blue. I want to say something, Hananuki said, without preamble, which was characteristic of him. I have thought about how to say it for a while and I have decided the best way is simply to say it. Go ahead, Izuku said. I respect you considerably, Hananuki said. Not just as a hero in training. As a person who is careful with power. I have power that could do real damage if I were careless with it, and I have spent years making sure I am never careless. When I watched you in October and November, I saw the same carefulness in you, and it is rare enough that I noticed it specifically. The carefulness became something else over the months. Something more personal. I am telling you this directly because indirect things tend to get lost, and this is not something I want lost. Izuku looked at him in the blue evening light. Thank you for saying it directly, he said. I think that's exactly right, by the way, about the carefulness. I've watched you do the same thing. Choose restraint when you didn't have to. I've thought about it more than once. Then we have seen the same thing in each other, Hananuki said, with the simple satisfaction of someone confirming a hypothesis. That feels like a good foundation. I think it is, Izuku said. He considered the specific shape of what he felt, now that it had been named, and found that it had been there for longer than he had given it credit for, present in the quiet respect that had built across their shared training sessions, present in the specific admiration he held for someone who chose gentleness when he had every capacity for force. What I feel for you, he said, is built on exactly that. The respect for someone who is careful with what they could do and chooses, every time, to do less than they could. I find that quality specifically and personally moving, not just professionally admirable. Hananuki nodded slowly. That is what I hoped you would say, he said. Not because I needed the validation. Because it would mean we understood the same thing about each other, and mutual understanding seemed like the right foundation for whatever this becomes. They sat on the steps for a while longer as the evening went fully blue and then began to dim toward dark, talking about smaller things, about training schedules and an upcoming assessment and the specific quality of spring evenings at UA, and Izuku thought that this, too, was a conversation that had not needed drama to matter, that had simply needed two honest people willing to name a true thing and let it stand in the open air, exactly as Rin had described it the week before. Chapter 37, Setsuna's Patience Pays Off. It occurred to Izuku, somewhere in the middle of April, that he had never actually had the formal honest conversation with Setsuna Tokage, despite the fact that she had been the one to tell him, all the way back in October, that he was not reaching, and despite the fact that she had narrated his entire arrival to the rest of the class, by her own admission, with the deliberate intention of shortening his timeline to understanding. He brought this up to her directly on a Tuesday afternoon in the common room, where she was reviewing notes with her usual relaxed confidence. "Tokage," he said. "I owe you the actual conversation. I've had it with everyone else. I never had it with you specifically, because you already knew, and somehow that meant I never said the words out loud." She looked up with an expression that managed to be both amused and genuinely moved at the same time, which he had learned was a specific combination she produced rarely and that meant something had landed somewhere real underneath the easy exterior. "I noticed that too," she said. "I decided not to push it because I didn't want to be the one who made you say it before you were ready. I've had plenty from you already, in the way you look at me, the way you save the last of the good tea for when I show up, the way you tell me things you don't tell other people because you trust that I'll just take them in without making a thing of it. I didn't need the words. I want to give them to you anyway," he said. "Properly. The way I gave them to everyone else." She set down her notes. "Okay," she said, with a quieter quality than her usual register. "Properly, then." He told her. He told her that what he felt for her was built on the specific gift she had given him in October, the gift of being told the truth before he had the courage to find it himself, and that he had thought, often, about how much harder his entire processing of the autumn would have been without her directness, and that the gratitude for that had grown, over the months, into something considerably warmer than gratitude alone. He told her that he loved the way she moved through the world without performing anything she did not feel, the way her detachment quirk was almost a metaphor for the way she lived, capable of being many places and perspectives at once without ever losing the thread of who she fundamentally was. He told her that of everyone in the class, she was the one whose honesty had given him permission to be honest himself, and that this made what he felt for her foundational in a way that was different from but not lesser than what he felt for the others. She was quiet when he finished, which was unusual enough for her that he noticed it immediately. "I have been waiting 4 months for that," she said finally. "And it was worth the wait." "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. "Don't be," she said. "You did it in the order that made sense to you. I would have been more suspicious if you'd led with me, honestly. I would have wondered if you were performing the order rather than feeling it." She smiled, the full unguarded version. "This is exactly right. Last, because I already knew, and because the others needed to hear it more urgently than I did. That's very you. I wouldn't have wanted it any other way." He felt something in his chest settle, the specific feeling of a thing finally being given its proper shape after months of existing without one. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've felt this since October too. I told you that you weren't reaching because I already knew exactly what I felt, and I was hoping you'd catch up eventually." "I caught up," he said. "You really did," she said, and reached over to bump her shoulder against his, the easy physical gesture of someone who had been comfortable with him for so long that the gesture required no deliberation at all. They sat together in the common room for the rest of the afternoon, and the conversation that followed was lighter, easier, full of the specific comfort of two people who had said the true thing and found that saying it changed nothing about how easy they already were together, only adding a layer of clarity underneath the ease that had always been there. Chapter 38, The Whole Class, Together. By the last week of April, every honest conversation had been had. 17 distinct exchanges, each shaped by the specific person it was offered to, each true in its own register, none of them performed and none of them rushed. Izuku sat with this fact on a Sunday evening in late April, in the common room with his notebook open to a page that summarized nothing and simply held, in his own handwriting, the names of everyone in the class and a single word or phrase beside each one that captured, as accurately as language allowed, the specific shape of what he felt for them. He had not shown this page to anyone. It was not for showing. It was for him, the private ledger of a year that had reorganized his understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere. Kendo found him there, as she often did in the quiet hours, and sat across from him without asking what he was working on, because she had learned, over the months, when to ask and when to simply be present. Everyone, he said, without her asking. I finished. All 17. She looked at him for a long moment. How does that feel? He considered the question with the care it deserved. Like the end of one thing and the beginning of another, he said. The arriving part is finished. What comes next is the staying part. The part where all of this has to be lived, day after day, rather than discovered. That's the harder part, Kendo said. I know, he said. I'm glad of that. I think the harder part is the part that actually means something. Discovery is exciting. Staying is what proves the discovery was real. She smiled, the full version. You're going to be good at staying, she said. You're thorough. Thorough people stay. Thorough Midoriya, he said, with the specific fondness the nickname had accumulated since Pony first used it in November. Thorough Midoriya, she agreed. Outside the common room window the April evening was settling into the specific blue that belonged to spring nights at UA, and somewhere in the building the rest of the class was doing the ordinary things that ordinary evenings were made of, studying and training and talking and existing together in the accumulated warmth of a year that had built something none of them could have designed in advance and that all of them, together, had made real through the simple daily choice to keep showing up honestly for each other. He closed the notebook. He looked at Kendo across the table, and beyond her, through the common room door, he could hear the layered sounds of the class going about its evening, Pony's laugh somewhere down the hall, Komori's voice explaining something with characteristic enthusiasm, the quieter murmur of Yanagi and Kodai working through something together in the study corner. 17 distinct people. 17 distinct truths, each one real, each one complete in itself, none of them diminished by the others. And 1 year, just beginning to become what it was going to be. He thought, sitting there in the blue April evening with Kendo across from him and the sound of his whole class around him, that he had found, without ever planning to look for it, exactly the thing he had not known he was missing. Not a single answer. A whole network of them. A whole class of people who had decided, separately and together, that he was worth knowing fully, and who had given him, in return for his own careful attention, the specific and irreplaceable gift of being fully known himself. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, entirely, the beginning of everything that came next. The King's Inheritance. A My Hero Academia fan series. Act 6, The Alert. Chapter 13, The Alert. The alarm came through the dormitory speakers at 11:40 in the evening on the second Friday of May, a sound that every UA student learned in their first month to distinguish from every other sound the building made, sharp and insistent and entirely unlike the gentler tones used for curfew reminders or weather notices. Izuku was awake within 2 seconds, the specific instant readiness that months of training had built into his nervous system, and he was dressed and in the hallway within 90 more, joining the converging current of Class 1B students moving toward the common room where the dormitory's emergency briefing screen was already lit. Vlad King's voice came through before his face appeared on the screen, clipped and focused in the particular register that meant the situation was real rather than a drill. All Class 1B students to the common room immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. By the time Izuku reached the common room, most of the class was already there, in various states of sleep-interrupted dress, and the rest filtered in within the next 30 seconds. Kendo was already at the front of the gathering crowd, her posture alert and her attention fixed on the screen with the particular quality she brought to moments that required her full functional presence. Vlad King's face resolved on the screen, and behind him, visible in fragments through the camera's framing, was the unmistakable chaos of an active command center, multiple voices, screens, the controlled urgency of professionals doing crisis work. There has been a coordinated incident at the Tatara Industrial District, approximately 40 minutes from the school by emergency transport, he said. A group identifying with extremist affiliations has taken control of a chemical processing facility and is holding an estimated 30 civilian workers. Pro-hero response is already on site, but the facility's structural complexity and the number of hostiles involved means additional support is required, including support capable of handling a building-scale rescue and containment scenario. He paused, and Izuku understood, in the half-second before the next sentence, exactly what was coming. Class 1B has been authorized for a support deployment under direct pro-hero supervision, Vlad King said. This is real. This is not a training exercise extended into the field. People could be hurt tonight, including possibly you. If any of you do not feel prepared for that reality, say so now, and there will be no consequence for staying behind. I need honest answers, not brave ones. Nobody spoke for the space of 3 seconds. Izuku looked around the room, at the faces of the people he had spent 8 months learning in the most complete way he had ever learned anyone, and saw in every one of them the same thing he felt in himself, the specific clarity that comes when training meets the moment it was built for and the body simply knows what to do because the mind has already done the deciding many times in simulation. We're ready, Kendo said, and the room confirmed it with the silent unanimous agreement of people who did not need to discuss something they had already decided, individually and collectively, many months ago. Then suit up, Vlad King said. Transport in 6 minutes. I will brief tactical assignments en route. The room dissolved into motion, the focused efficient motion of people who had drilled this exact transition more times than any of them could count, and Izuku found himself moving through the familiar choreography of preparation while his mind ran, in parallel, the analysis that came automatically now, the same analysis he had been running on this class since October, except that tonight the analysis was not academic. Tonight it was the thing that would keep people alive. He thought, pulling on his gear in the locker room with Awaze and Shishida moving with the same urgent efficiency beside him, that everything of the past 8 months, every honest conversation, every training session, every quiet evening of accumulated trust, had been building towards something, and he had not fully understood, until this exact moment, that the something might be this. Not just a deepening of feeling. A readiness. A team that had become, through care and time and the patient accumulation of trust, something that could be relied upon completely when it mattered most. He met Kendo's eyes across the locker room as she finished her own preparation. She gave him the small nod that had become, over the months, a complete sentence between them. 6 minutes, she said. 6 minutes, he agreed, and they moved together toward the transport bay, the whole of Class 1B converging from different directions into the same point, the same purpose, the same readiness. Chapter 40, Tactical Assignments. The transport vehicle was a modified personnel carrier built for exactly this purpose, rapid student deployment under pro-hero supervision, and it covered the 40 minutes to the Tatara Industrial District in considerably less time than that, the driver navigating with the practiced urgency of someone who had made this exact drive under exactly these circumstances more times than civilians ever knew about. Vlad King briefed them through the vehicle's internal comm system, his voice steady and his information dense, the specific economical communication style of someone who had learned, across years of field command, exactly how much detail a team needed and exactly how little time there usually was to deliver it. The facility is a 4-story chemical processing plant, he said, as the schematic appeared on the small screen mounted at the front of the cabin. The hostiles, current count 6 to 8, have secured the central control room on the 2nd floor and are holding the hostages in the adjacent storage bay. Pro-heroes Edshot and Mirko are already engaging the perimeter. Our assignment is interior rescue and containment support while the pros handle direct confrontation with the hostiles' leadership. He pulled up a more detailed schematic, and the class leaned forward as one body, the collective focus of people who had spent 8 months training exactly this kind of rapid tactical absorption. Kendo, Midoriya, Shiozaki, Shota. Primary Extraction Team. Your job is getting into the storage bay through the secondary maintenance corridor, identified here, and getting the hostages out through the south loading dock, which Edshot's team will keep clear. You will not engage the hostiles directly unless there is no alternative. Your priority is the civilians, full stop. He continued through the assignments with the same density. Yanagi and Kodai would handle structural stabilization, using their respective quirks to manage the facility's chemical storage systems and prevent a secondary disaster if the confrontation upstairs triggered any of the volatile materials in storage. Tokage, Awaze, and Kaibara would form a flexible response unit, positioned to adapt to whatever the situation actually produced rather than what it was predicted to produce, because flexible response units existed precisely because predictions in active crises were never fully reliable. Komori and her spore capabilities would provide a non-lethal crowd suppression option if any of the hostiles attempted to flee into the wider facility. Pony's horn cannons would support structural breach operations if any of the planned entry points proved compromised. The remaining students would hold the perimeter staging area, ready to reinforce wherever the situation required. Izuku listened to all of it with the specific quality of attention that combined his usual analytical depth with something sharper and more immediate, the awareness that every name in this briefing was a person he had spent 8 months coming to know completely, and that the assignments Vlad King was reading were not abstractions but the actual deployment of 17 people he cared about into a situation with real danger in it. Questions, Vlad King said, not as an invitation so much as a final check. The maintenance corridor, Izuku said. Is there confirmed structural integrity, or are we working from the building schematics alone? Schematics alone, Vlad King said. The facility has been compromised for approximately 90 minutes. We do not have updated structural data. Then I want to go in first, Izuku said. If there's a structural failure, I can absorb it and create a path. I'd rather find out what's wrong with the corridor before the rest of the extraction team is inside it. Vlad King considered this for the length of exactly one breath. Approved, he said. Kendo, your team adjusts to Midoriya leading entry. Kendo looked at Izuku from across the cabin, her expression unreadable to anyone who had not spent 8 months learning to read it, but entirely legible to him, the specific mixture of professional agreement and personal concern that she did not bother hiding because hiding it would have been a kind of dishonesty she had stopped practicing with him months ago. Understood, she said, to Vlad King. And then, quieter, to Izuku alone, don't be a hero about it. Be careful about it. I will be both, he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than the tactical conversation strictly required, and in that moment was contained everything that 8 months had built between them, the trust and the care and the specific fear that comes from caring about someone enough that their safety becomes a thing you carry alongside your own. The transport slowed. The schematic screen went dark. Vlad King's voice came through one final time. We are 2 minutes out, he said. Final gear check. From here, you are operating as deployed hero support, not as students. Act accordingly. The cabin filled with the quiet focused motion of 17 people checking their gear one last time, and Izuku, checking his own with hands that were steady in the specific way that comes from having trained the steadiness rather than faked it, thought that this was the moment everything since October had been preparing them for, not the romance, not the warmth, though those mattered and would continue to matter, but this, the test of whether the trust they had built could hold under actual pressure. He believed it could. He believed it because he had watched it being built, person by person, conversation by conversation, across 8 months of patient honest attention, and he did not believe that something built that carefully could fail when it mattered most. The transport doors opened onto the noise and light of the staging area, and Class 1B moved out into the night, together. Chapter 41, The Maintenance Corridor. The Tatara facility at night was a landscape of industrial shadow broken by the harsh portable floodlights the pro-hero response team had established at the perimeter, and Izuku moved through it at the head of the extraction team with the specific heightened awareness that came from every sense being deployed at once. Sound and sight and the particular feel of structural vibration through his feet that told him things about the building's stability that no schematic could have shown him. The secondary maintenance corridor was exactly where the schematic indicated, a narrow service passage running along the facility's east wall, accessible through a door that Pony's horn cannons had cleared in 11 seconds with the precise minimal force that turned what could have been a lab breach into something closer to a careful unlocking. Izuku went first, as agreed, moving down the corridor with full cowl engaged at a level calibrated for rapid response rather than raw power, every nerve attuned to the structure around him. The corridor's integrity was, as he had suspected from the building's age and the 90 minutes of unmonitored stress it had endured, compromised in two places, a section of ceiling support that had begun to sag under heat stress from a nearby processing unit, and a section of flooring that sounded, under his weight, subtly hollow in a way that the schematics had not indicated. Ceiling support failing in 15 feet, he said into his calm, his voice steady with the specific calm of someone whose body was operating from trained instinct rather than panic. And there's a void under the floor around the 20-foot mark. I'm going to test it. Don't test it by falling into it, Kendo's voice came back, dry even under pressure, and he felt something in his chest ease slightly at the specific quality of her voice holding its character even now. He tested it by extending a careful application of Delaware smash downward through his foot rather than his whole weight, a controlled fraction of force that confirmed the void's presence and approximate depth without committing his full mass to the discovery. The floor held under the test. It would not hold under the full extraction team moving through its speed. Floor's compromised but passable if we go single file and lightfoot, he reported. Ceiling support needs handling before anyone goes under it. I can handle the ceiling, Shiozaki's voice came through, calm and certain. If you can hold position at the failure point and give me a visual, I can reinforce it with vine lattice. It will not be permanent but it will hold for the extraction window. Izuku held position, full cowl steady, watching the sagging support with the patient attention he had learned, over the months, was Shiozaki's own particular gift, the interior stillness inside physical motion that she had been working on since their February conversation in the covered walkway. She moved up beside him, and the vines from her hair extended in the controlled precise arcs he had spent months studying, weaving through the failing support structure with a speed and accuracy that told him, more clearly than any conversation could have, exactly how much progress she had made on the reframe he had offered her. It will hold, she said, stepping back to assess her work with the same calm focus. Move the team through now, while the lattice is fresh. Kendo brought the rest of the extraction team through behind them, Nairenjiki Shota moving with the careful economical steps of someone trusting Izuku's assessment of the floor completely, no hesitation in the trust because 8 months had established exactly how reliable that assessment would be. They reached the end of the corridor, a heavy service door that opened, according to the schematic, directly into the storage bay where the hostages were being held. Izuku held up a hand, the signal for full stop, and pressed his palm flat against the door's surface, reading the vibration on the other side with the specific quirk-enhanced sensitivity that months of training had refined into something close to a sixth sense. Multiple people on the other side, he said quietly. At least 6 distinct movement patterns. No immediate activity near this door. I think we have a clean entry point. Kendo moved up beside him, her hands already at their working size, ready. Shota positioned on his other side, his quirk's force-doubling capacity held in reserve. Shiozaki took the rear position, vines coiled and ready for either offense or the kind of careful extraction support that the hostages would need once the door opened. On my count, Kendo said, and the 4 of them settled into the specific readiness of a team that had trained together enough times that the readiness required no further discussion, only the shared understanding that had been built, conversation by conversation, training session by training session, across 8 months that had led, with a clarity that felt almost inevitable in retrospect, directly to this exact door, this exact moment, this exact team standing together at the edge of the thing they had all, individually and collectively, been preparing for since October. Chapter 42, The Storage Bay. The door opened on Kendo's count into a wide industrial storage bay lit by the harsh fluorescent overheads that had clearly not been switched off despite the facility's takeover, and the scene that resolved in front of them was exactly what the intelligence had predicted and somehow still managed to land with the full visceral weight of reality. 31 civilian workers seated in tight clusters along the bay's far wall, 2 armed hostiles positioned at visible intervals, and the particular tense stillness of people who had been afraid for 90 minutes and had not yet allowed themselves to believe rescue was real. Izuku's analysis ran faster than conscious thought, the specific trained speed that 8 months of tactical study had built into reflex, registering the 2 visible hostiles' positions and likely response patterns, the layout of the hostages relative to the exits, the 3 additional exit routes the schematic had shown and which of them remained viable given what he could now see of the bay's actual condition. 2 visible, he said, low and immediate, the calm carrying his voice to the rest of the team without carrying it to the room. Northeast corner and the position by the loading door. No visual on the other 4 to 6 the briefing mentioned. They may be upstairs with the main confrontation. Copy, Kendo said. Shota, north position. I'll take the loading door. Shiozaki, you and Midoriya manage the hostages the second the positions are clear. It happened with the specific efficient speed of a plan executing exactly as practiced, Shota moving with controlled explosive force toward the northeast hostel, his twin impact quirk doubling the force of a strike that needed only to incapacitate rather than harm severely, and the hostel went down before he had completed turning toward the sound of the door. Kendo's expanded hand closed around the loading door hostel's weapon in the same half-second, a controlled grip that disarmed without breaking, the specific precision she had spent 8 months refining into something that looked, in the moment, almost gentle despite the speed and force behind it. Izuku was already moving toward the hostages before the second hostel had fully registered what was happening to him, Shiozaki beside him with vines extending in a protective arc that created a moving shield between the captives and any possibility of a third hostel emerging from elsewhere in the bay. We're UA support, you're safe, we need you to move quickly and quietly toward the corridor behind us, Izuku said to the nearest cluster of workers, his voice carrying the specific calm authority that he had practiced in 100 training simulations and that landed, here, in the real moment, with exactly the effect it was meant to have, the immediate visible relaxation of people who had been told, by someone whose competence was evident in every controlled movement, that the worst of the danger was over. The extraction moved with the smooth practiced efficiency of a plan working exactly as intended, 31 workers moving in an organized line through the maintenance corridor under Shiozaki's vine lattice ceiling and across the floor Izuku had already tested, with Shota and Kendo securing the rear against any possibility of reinforcement from upstairs. It was at the corridor's midpoint, with perhaps 2/3 of the hostages already through, that the building shuddered with a deep structural groan that had nothing to do with the maintenance corridor's known weak points and everything to do with something happening on the floor above them. That's the confrontation upstairs, Kendo's voice came through the calm, tight but controlled. Ed Shota and Mirko must have engaged the leadership directly. The groan came again, longer this time, and Izuku felt it through his feet before he heard Yanagi's voice cut into the calm with the specific precision she brought to crisis communication, no wasted words, only exactly what mattered. Structural stress is building in the chemical storage section, she said. Kodai and I are managing it, but the confrontation upstairs is putting pressure on systems that were already compromised. We can hold it. But the timeline for full evacuation has compressed. Izuku looked at the remaining hostages still moving through the corridor, at the ceiling lattice that Shiozaki had built to hold for an extraction window that had just become considerably more urgent, and made the calculation that 8 months of training had prepared him to make instantly and without hesitation. Everyone move faster, but stay in formation, he said, his voice carrying clearly to both the hostages and his team. Shiozaki, can your lattice hold under additional stress? It can hold, she said, and he heard, underneath the calm professional register, the specific quality of complete confidence that came from someone who had tested her own capabilities thoroughly enough to know their true limits. I will not let it fail while people are under it. He believed her completely, the same way he had believed, every single time across 8 months, that when the people of this class told him something was true, it was true, because they had built, together, a foundation where dishonesty had no function and no presence, and that foundation was, in this exact moment, the thing keeping 31 strangers alive. Chapter 43, Komori at the loading dock. While the extraction team moved hostages through the maintenance corridor and Yanagi and Kodai held the chemical storage section together through pure coordinated precision, Kanoko Komori was stationed at the facility's south loading dock with a job that looked, on the surface, considerably less dramatic than either of those efforts, and that proved, within the first 10 minutes of the operation, to be exactly as critical as anything happening elsewhere in the building. Her assignment was crowd suppression, a clinical phrase for a task that meant, in practice, standing at the single most likely escape route for any hostile who decided that the confrontation upstairs made flight more attractive than continued resistance, and being prepared to neutralize that flight without causing harm, using a quirk that most people still underestimated as decorative. She had set up her position with the same careful attention she gave to identifying fungal specimens in the wild, mapping the loading dock's airflow patterns in the few minutes before the operation began, noting where a released spore cloud would settle thickest and where it would thin, calculating the specific timing that would let her deploy with maximum effect and minimum collateral exposure to her own teammates moving through the same space. The moment came 20 minutes into the operation, when a seventh hostile, previously unaccounted for in the briefing's estimate, broke from the upstairs confrontation and ran for the loading dock with the specific desperate speed of someone who understood that the operation above him had already failed and that escape was now his only remaining option. Komori saw him from her position behind a stacked pallet of shipping containers and did not hesitate. She released a targeted cloud of her sedative variety spores in a precise arc that intersected his only viable path to the dock's exit, a cloud calculated to disperse at exactly the density needed to incapacitate without causing any lasting harm, the specific tactical refinement that Izuku had identified, back in November, as the thing that made her quirk dramatically more sophisticated than its appearance suggested. The hostile ran directly into the cloud's leading edge and went down within 4 steps, his legs giving out from under him in the gentle controlled collapse that Komori's careful calibration had been designed to produce, and she was moving toward him within seconds, securing his position with the quick efficient binding work that every UA student trained in regardless of their primary quirk specialization. Seventh hostile down at the loading dock, she reported into her calm, her voice carrying a calm steadiness that surprised even her, in the small distant part of her mind that was still capable of self-observation even in the middle of active deployment. No injuries. He'll be out for approximately 20 minutes based on the dosage. Good work, Vlad King's voice came back, brief and clearly occupied with monitoring several other developing situations at once. Hold position. There may be others. She held position, scanning the dock's approach routes with the patient attention that she brought to everything, and thought, in the quiet space between the adrenaline of the encounter and the waiting that followed it, about the conversation she had had with Izuku in January about mycelial networks and resilience, about nodes and connections and the way a healthy system distributed its strength rather than concentrating it in a single vulnerable point. She understood clearly in that moment, exactly the kind of node the theory described, positioned at an unglamorous junction that nobody would notice in the after-action reports unless something had gone wrong there, doing exactly the unglamorous critical work that made the showier parts of the operation possible. She found, examining the thought, that she did not mind this at all. She found, in fact, that she took a specific quiet pride in it, the pride of someone who understood her own value clearly enough that she did not need anyone else's notice to confirm it. No further hostiles came. The operation resolved upstairs within the following 10 minutes, and Komori's position at the loading dock transitioned smoothly into the operation's final phase, providing a clear secured route for the medical teams and the recovered hostages to move through on their way to the waiting transports. When Izuku found her afterward, in the floodlit staging area, he had already heard about the seventh hostile from the operational debrief that was beginning to circulate among the team. "You caught the one nobody else saw coming," he said. "I was paying attention to the place nobody else was looking," she said, with the simple satisfaction of someone whose contribution had mattered exactly as much as she had hoped it would. That's usually where the important things happen. The overlooked places. He looked at her for a long moment, the specific warm attention he had given her since the rainy afternoon in the simulation room back in November, and said, "I don't think I tell you often enough how much I notice the things you do in the overlooked places." "You tell me plenty," she said, but she was smiling the wide unguarded smile that was entirely hers, and she leaned into his side in the simple wordless way that had become, over the months, one of her most natural forms of communication, and he put his arm around her shoulders without needing to be asked, and they stood together in the floodlit night while the rest of the operation wound down around them. Chapter 44, Pony at the Breach Point. Pony Tsunotori's assignment placed her at the facility's west wall, supporting the flexible response unit's ability to create new entry points if the planned routes through the building proved compromised, a role that required her to remain in continuous readiness for nearly the entire duration of the operation without the satisfaction of immediate visible action that some of the other assignments provided. She found, standing at her position with her horn cannons primed and her attention fixed on the calm traffic carrying updates from every other part of the building, that the waiting was its own particular kind of difficult, harder in some ways than direct engagement would have been, because waiting left room for the mind to consider, in vivid and unhelpful detail, every person she cared about who was somewhere inside that building doing something that could go wrong. She managed the waiting the way she managed most difficult things, by anchoring herself in something concrete and specific rather than letting her thoughts spiral into the abstract territory of generalized fear. She focused on the wall in front of her, on the precise calculations of force and angle that a breach through this particular section would require if it became necessary, on the calm traffic itself, parsing each update for information rather than letting the updates simply wash over her as undifferentiated tension. When the structural groan rolled through the building, the same one that had reached the extraction team in the corridor and Yanagi and Kodai in the storage section, she felt it through the wall itself, a deep resonant shudder that traveled through the concrete and into her hands where they rested against her cannon housing, and she understood, with the specific clarity of someone whose training had taught her to read structural stress accurately, that the building's overall integrity had just taken a meaningful new hit. West wall reporting structural shift, she said into the calm, her Japanese precise and calm despite the moment's tension. Recommend caution on any plan requiring this wall's load-bearing capacity. Copy, Tsunotori, Vlad King's voice came back. Hold position. Updated structural assessment in progress. She held position, running her own assessment in parallel, and when Away's voice came through the calm 5 minutes later requesting an emergency breach point because the flexible response unit had encountered a sealed internal door that the original plan had not accounted for, she was ready with a precise answer before the request had even fully finished. I can breach here, she said. Calculated load is within safe parameters if I target the lower third of the section rather than the center mass. Confirm timing. Confirmed, Away said. On your mark. She fired with the careful precision that months of training had built into her, the cannon's force directed exactly where her calculation had indicated, and the wall section gave way cleanly, opening a new path that let the flexible response unit reach a group of workers who had been sheltering in an internal office space that the original schematic had not fully detailed. The relief in Away's voice when he confirmed the breach's success carried clearly through the calm, and she felt, in the wake of her own successful action, the specific satisfaction of having turned the long difficult waiting into something that had actually mattered, the proof that readiness itself was a form of contribution even during the long stretches when nothing visible was happening. She thought, in the brief quiet that followed before the next development required her attention, about the language sessions she had been having with Izuku since October, about the patience those sessions had taught her, the specific discipline of staying present and attentive through long stretches where visible progress felt slow, trusting that the accumulated attention would matter even when its results were not immediately obvious. She understood, standing at the breach point in the floodlit dark, that the patience she had practiced in those quiet morning lounge sessions had become, without her fully noticing the transfer, the same patience that had let her hold her position calmly through the long uncertain wait before tonight's single decisive action. When the operation concluded and the staging area filled with the loose exhausted relief of a crisis successfully resolved, she found Izuku near the medical tent, and she crossed the distance between them with the same forward unhurried momentum she brought to everything, and did not say anything at first, simply standing close enough that he understood, without words, exactly what she needed. He put his arms around her, and she let herself, finally, feel the full weight of the waiting she had been managing all night, the fear she had kept carefully anchored rather than let overwhelm her readiness. I was scared the whole time, she said quietly, in English, the language she sometimes used when something needed to be said with a particular kind of honesty that felt, to her, easier to access in a language that was not the one she had grown up afraid in. I know, he said. I was too. For you. For all of you. But we did the thing anyway, she said. Scared the whole time and we did it anyway. That's what tonight was, he said, echoing, without either of them realizing it, almost exactly what Kendo had said to him in nearly the same words an hour earlier, the specific shared understanding that had settled, independently and simultaneously, into nearly everyone who had been part of the operation tonight. She held on to him a while longer in the floodlit dark, and then, gradually, the tension she had been carrying since the alarm first sounded began, finally, to ease. Chapter 45, Tokage's Flexible Response. Setsuna Tokage's assignment to the Flexible Response Unit suited her in a way that she recognized immediately upon receiving it, because flexibility had always been her particular gift, not just in the literal sense of her quirk's capacity for detachment and independent control, but in the deeper sense of a mind that adapted naturally to changing circumstances without requiring the comfort of a fixed plan. She moved through the facility's interior corridors with Awase and Kaibara, the three of them functioning as the operation's improvisational backbone, ready to respond to whatever the situation actually produced rather than what the briefing had predicted, and the situation, as situations in active crises reliably did, produced considerably more than the briefing had predicted. It was Tokage who first identified the sealed internal office that would eventually require Pony's emergency breach, noticing, through a combination of careful listening and the detached awareness her quirk granted her, the unmistakable sound of frightened people on the other side of a door that the original schematic had marked simply as storage. "There's people behind this door," she said, pressing her detached ear, quite literally separated from the rest of her head and held against the door's surface with the specific casual practicality that long practice had made entirely unremarkable to her, though it never failed to startle anyone witnessing it for the first time. At least 3 voices. Frightened but not in immediate distress. "Doors sealed from the inside," Kaibara said, testing the handle with his enhanced strength and confirming what the door's resistance had already suggested. "They locked themselves in when the takeover started." "Smart, but it means we need another way in." "I'll call it in," Tokage said, already moving toward the comm relay point that the operations layout required for reliable transmission through the facility's interference-heavy interior. "Awase, can you reinforce a breach point if Tsunotori opens one from outside?" "Give me 30 seconds to assess the wall composition," Awase said, already running his hands along the relevant section with the focused attention he brought to anything involving his fusion quirk's careful application. "If she breaches at the lower third, I can weld a stable frame around the opening so it doesn't collapse further once people start moving through it." The plan assembled itself in the specific rapid improvisational way that Tokage had always found, privately, to be one of the most satisfying parts of genuine teamwork, the sense of 3 people building a solution together faster than any one of them could have built it alone, each contribution clicking into the gaps the others had left, the way her own detached body parts worked together as a coordinated whole despite operating, in the most literal sense, as separate pieces. When the breach opened and the 3 frightened office workers emerged, blinking in the harsh light and shaking with the specific relief of people who had spent 90 minutes genuinely unsure whether anyone would find them in time, Tokage was the one who spoke to them first, her voice carrying the warm direct reassurance that had always been one of her most natural qualities, the same directness that had once told a quirkless feeling transfer student in October that he was not reaching, now turned toward strangers who needed exactly that same quality of unflinching honest comfort. "You're safe now," she told them. "We've got you. Just follow me, nice and easy, we'll have you out of here in a few minutes." She led them back through the corridors with the same unhurried confidence she brought to everything, and Kaibara and Awase formed a protective perimeter around the small group without needing to discuss the formation, the 3 of them moving as the single coordinated unit that 8 months of shared training had built, regardless of how unpredictable tonight's specific circumstances had turned out to be. Later, in the staging area, when the 3 rescued office workers had been handed off to the medical team and the immediate adrenaline of the rescue had begun its slow retreat, Tokage found Izuku standing near the transport vehicles, and she came to stand beside him with the easy familiar comfort that defined nearly all of their interactions. "We found 3 more than the briefing accounted for," she said. "Just sitting there behind a door nobody flagged." "I heard," he said. "That's good work. The kind that doesn't show up dramatically in the after-action report but that mattered completely to the people you found." "I think that's most of what tonight actually was," she said. 100 small good decisions nobody will ever fully appreciate, adding up to 34 people going home instead of 31. 34, he repeated, and felt the number land with the specific weight that exact numbers always carried when they represented actual people rather than abstractions. 34, she confirmed. She looked at him for a long moment in the floodlit dark, with the particular quality of someone who had been watching him carefully for 8 months and had not, even tonight, in the middle of a genuine crisis, stopped doing so. "You did good tonight too." The corridor assessment, leading entry first. "I watched you do exactly the kind of thing I always knew you'd do when it actually mattered. I had a lot of help being ready for it," he said. 8 months of it. "Yeah," she said, with the simple satisfied warmth of someone who had played her own particular part in building that readiness from the very first week of October. "You did." Chapter 46, Shota's wrist and Shiozaki's watch. Nairenjiki Shota's sprained wrist, the single notable injury sustained by Class 1B across the entire operation, happened in the final minute of the storage bay engagement, the precise moment when his twin impact quirk's doubled force met an unexpected resistance from the second hostile's reinforced gear. A piece of improvised armor that the intelligence briefing had not anticipated and that absorbed considerably more of the strike's force than his hand had been braced to deliver. He did not register the injury fully until the immediate engagement had concluded, the specific delayed pain response that adrenaline produces in genuine crisis moments, and it was Shiozaki who noticed first, her attention, even in the middle of managing the hostage extraction, extending to the small change in his movement pattern that told her something was wrong before he had said anything about it himself. "Your wrist," she said, catching his arm gently as the extraction line moved past them toward the corridor. "You are favoring it." "It's fine," he said, with the specific reflexive minimization that most hero students learned early and that Shiozaki, having spent considerable time around Izuku's own version of the same habit, had become particularly skilled at recognizing and refusing to accept at face value. "It is not fine if you are favoring it," she said. "Let me see." He held out his hand, and she examined the visible swelling already beginning along the wrist's outer edge with the careful attentive focus she brought to everything, her vines extending in a gentle supportive wrap that immobilized the joint without restricting his continued participation in the extraction. "Sprained, not broken," she said. "But it needs support for the remainder of the operation. This will hold it stable." "Thank you," he said, genuinely grateful, and the two of them rejoined the extraction's final movements, Shota continuing his rearguard position with his uninjured hand and Shiozaki's vine support keeping the injured wrist protected through the remaining minutes of urgent movement. It was a small moment in the context of the night's larger events, the kind of unglamorous care that rarely featured in any account of a crisis but that mattered, completely, to the person receiving it, and Izuku, hearing about it afterward in the staging area, found himself thinking about it longer than the moment's apparent scale seemed to warrant. He found Shiozaki near the medical tent, where she had walked Shota personally to ensure Recovery Girl's team had received him properly before allowing herself to consider her own part in the operation complete. "I heard about Shota's wrist," he said. "And about you noticing it before he said anything. I have learned to notice these things," she said, with a small private quality to her voice that he recognized immediately, the specific reference to the months of watching him minimize his own injuries that had taught her, originally, to look for exactly this pattern in others. "You learned it from watching me be bad at admitting when something hurts," he said. "Yes," she said, without apology, because apology would have implied the lesson had been unwelcome rather than valuable. "I am glad I learned it. It mattered tonight." "It did," he agreed. "It really did." She looked at him in the floodlit dark, with the same calm steady quality she had brought to the entire operation, the interior stillness she had been cultivating since their February conversation now fully integrated into how she moved through even the most demanding circumstances. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what tonight has taught me about the reframe you offered me in February. The stillness inside the motion. I used it in the corridor, reinforcing the ceiling. I used it just now, with Shota's wrist, staying calm enough to notice clearly rather than reacting with alarm that would have helped no one." She paused. "It works. Completely. I wanted you to know that the thing you gave me in the covered walkway has become something I can rely on now, under real pressure, not just in training." He felt something in his chest warm at this, the specific satisfaction of having offered something months ago that had grown, in someone else's careful hands, into exactly the capability it had been intended to become. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm glad it held." "It held," she confirmed. "Everything we built this year held tonight. I do not think that is a coincidence. I think it is the direct result of how carefully this year was built, conversation by conversation, the way you have always done everything." They stood together near the medical tent in the settling quiet of the operation's conclusion, and somewhere behind them, Shota emerged from Recovery Girl's care with his wrist properly bandaged and a grateful nod in Shiozaki's direction, and the staging area continued its slow transition from crisis to resolution, person by person, exactly the way the entire year had built itself, patiently and honestly, one careful attentive act at a time. Chapter 47, What Yanagi and Kodai Held. While the extraction team moved the hostages through the maintenance corridor, Reiko Yanagi and Yui Kodai were 3 rooms away, in the facility's chemical storage section, doing the kind of unglamorous critical work that rarely appeared in hero coverage but that determined, more often than dramatic confrontations did, whether a crisis resolved as a rescue or as a catastrophe. The storage section held 47 sealed containers of industrial solvents and reactive compounds, the kind of materials that, under normal operating conditions, were managed by automated climate and pressure systems that had been running without proper oversight for 90 minutes and that were now, under the additional stress of the confrontation happening 2 floors above, beginning to show readings that neither Yanagi nor Kodai found acceptable. Container 14 is approaching thermal threshold, Yanagi said, her voice carrying the specific calm precision that had always characterized her and that, under pressure, had not changed at all, because pressure did not alter what someone fundamentally was, it only revealed it more clearly. I can use poltergeist to relocate it to the cooling bay, but the relocation itself carries risk if the container's integrity is already compromised. I can resize it, Kodai said. Reduce its volume and surface area simultaneously. That reduces the thermal load without requiring movement. Do it, Yanagi said. I will monitor the seal integrity while you resize. If it shows signs of failure during the process, I will need to stabilize it externally. They worked in the specific synchronized efficiency that had been building between them since the February evenings in the library, when their separate research habits had begun to intersect into something that functioned, now, as a single coordinated unit operating from complete mutual trust. Kodai's resizing application was precise and immediate, the container's volume contracting smoothly under her quirk's careful application, and Yanagi's monitoring caught, in the same instant, a microscopic stress fracture along the container's seam that the resizing process had revealed. Seal compromise, 0.2 centimeters, northeast seam, Yanagi said, already moving, her quirk extending a careful field of pressure around the affected area that held the seam closed through psychokinetic force alone, a level of precision control that few quirk users in the entire hero population could have managed under this kind of time pressure. Resizing complete, Kodai said. Thermal load reduced by 60%. Can you hold the seal until I reinforce it externally? I can hold it, Yanagi said, and there was no strain audible in her voice despite the fact that Izuku, had he been there to see it, would have recognized the specific intensity of focus that Yanagi brought to her most demanding applications, the complete interior stillness she had described to him once as the thing that made her quirk's precision possible, deployed now in service of keeping a roomful of volatile chemicals from becoming the second disaster of the night. Kodai produced, from the emergency kit at her hip, a rapid cure sealant compound standard to hero emergency response, and resized it with practiced efficiency to exactly the dimension needed for the compromised seam, applying it with the careful economical motion that characterized everything she did. The sealant set within seconds, and Yanagi released her psychokinetic hold the instant the cure registered as complete, neither of them wasting a single unnecessary moment of effort once the actual need had passed. Container 14 stable, Yanagi reported into the comm, moving to Container 22, which is showing similar stress signatures. They moved through the storage section with the same efficient coordination, addressing 4 more containers showing concerning readings before the structural groan from upstairs, the one that had reached the extraction team in the corridor, reached them as well, a deep resonant shudder that ran through the entire building's frame and that registered, on Yanagi's instruments, as a significant new stress event across the entire storage section simultaneously. That changes the calculation, Kodai said, already moving toward the nearest affected container. Agreed, Yanagi said. I am extending Poltergeist's range to cover the full section simultaneously rather than container by container. It will require more of my attention, but it is the more efficient response given the compressed timeline. Can you sustain that? Kodai said, the question carrying the specific weight of genuine concern beneath its practical phrasing, because 8 months of knowing Yanagi had taught Kodai exactly how to read the difference between Yanagi's confident capability and Yanagi's true limits, a distinction Yanagi herself was sometimes slower to acknowledge than the people who watched her carefully. I can sustain it for the duration required, Yanagi said. I have calibrated for exactly this kind of demand. It was, Kodai understood, exactly the kind of answer Yanagi would give whether or not it was fully true, because Yanagi's commitment to completing what she had decided to complete sometimes outran her own assessment of her limits. But Kodai also understood, from 8 months of precise observation, that Yanagi's calibration claims were, in fact, almost always accurate, because Yanagi tested everything before claiming it, and a claim of sustainable capacity from Reiko Yanagi was, in Kodai's careful experience, as reliable as any measurement instrument available. I trust your calibration, Kodai said, and meant it completely, and the two of them held the storage section's stability together for the 11 minutes it took the confrontation upstairs to resolve, 11 minutes during which neither of them said anything further that was not strictly necessary, because the trust between them had reached the specific point where unnecessary words would only have diluted the complete and silent confidence they had in each other's capability. Chapter 48, The Confrontation Resolves. The structural groans that had reached both the extraction team in the corridor and Yanagi and Kodai in the storage section had their origin 2 floors above, where pro-heroes Ed Shot and Mirko had engaged the facility takeover's leadership in a confrontation that resolved, in the end, with considerably less drama than the building's structural complaints had suggested, because Ed Shot's precision and Mirko's raw capability had together overwhelmed the remaining hostiles within minutes of full engagement. The structural stress, an unfortunate side effect of a fight conducted in a building never designed to withstand pro-hero level combat rather than evidence of the confrontation's difficulty. Izuku learned this only afterward, in the staging area outside the facility, where Class 1B regrouped in the specific exhausted relief that follows successful crisis response, the adrenaline beginning its slow retreat and leaving, in its wake, the full weight of what had actually happened settling into each person's understanding at their own particular pace. He found Kendo first, near the medical tent where the extracted workers were receiving the standard post-incident evaluation, her posture finally allowing itself the slight relaxation that command responsibility had not permitted during the active extraction. 31, she said, before he had even fully reached her. All 31 accounted for. No serious injuries among the hostages. 2 minor injuries on our side, nothing requiring more than basic treatment. I heard, he said. Shota's wrist? Sprained, not broken. Recovery girl already looked at it. She exhaled, the specific exhale of someone allowing a held breath to finally release. We did it. All of us. Exactly the way we trained for it. He looked at her in the harsh portable floodlight, at the specific exhaustion and relief mixed together on her face, and felt the full weight of what the night had actually meant arrive in him all at once, not as analysis now but as feeling, complete and unguarded. You were extraordinary, he said. The whole team was. But you specifically. The way you held the command structure together while also being in the middle of the actual physical confrontation. I don't think I fully understood, until tonight, exactly how much capacity you carry. She looked at him for a long moment. I was terrified, she said, with a directness that the adrenaline aftermath seemed to have stripped of its usual careful management. Not for myself. For you, going into that corridor first, not knowing what the floor or the ceiling would do. For Shiozaki, holding that lattice. For Yanagi and Kodai, in a room full of chemicals that could have gone wrong in 100 different ways. I was terrified the entire time and I did not let it show because the team needed me steady, but I want you to know that the terror was there, underneath the steadiness, the whole time. I know, he said. I felt the same thing. For all of you. The whole time. And we did it anyway, she said. Steady on top of terrified. That's what tonight actually was. That's what hero work actually is, he said. I don't think I fully understood that before tonight either. Not the way I understand it now. She reached out and took his hand, there in the floodlit staging area with the medical tent's activity continuing around them, a simple uncomplicated gesture that needed no further explanation between two people who had spent 8 months building exactly the kind of trust that made the gesture feel inevitable rather than remarkable. Around them, the rest of Class 1B was finding each other in the same way. The specific post-crisis gravitational pull of people checking, with their own eyes and their own hands, that everyone they cared about had truly come through safely. Pony was talking rapidly to Komori in a mixture of relieved Japanese and English, gesturing with the particular animation of someone processing adrenaline through speech. Tokage had both her physical hands wrapped around Shiozaki's in a grip that conveyed considerably more than the simple words she was saying. Yanagi and Kodai emerged from the facility together, moving with the specific synchronized economy of two people who had just spent 11 minutes holding a chemical storage section together through pure coordinated competence, and the rest of the class converged on them with the same relieved attention. Vlad King's voice cut through the staging area's noise, carrying the specific tired satisfaction of a teacher whose students had just proven, under the highest possible stakes, that 8 months of training had built exactly what it was meant to build. Good work, all of you, he said. Genuinely good work. Transport home in 15 minutes. Get checked by medical first, every one of you, no exceptions. Izuku stood with Kendo's hand still in his, watching his class regroup around him in the floodlit night, and thought that this, more than any of the individual conversations that had built across the autumn and winter and spring, was the proof that mattered most, not because the conversations had been less real, but because tonight had tested whether the warmth they had built together could hold its shape under genuine pressure, and it had held, completely, exactly the way trust built honestly always holds when it is finally asked to bear real weight. Chapter 14, The Ride Home. The transport back to UA carried a different quality than the transport out had carried, the urgent focused tension of the outbound journey replaced by the specific loose exhausted warmth of a team that had done difficult work successfully and was now allowed, finally, to simply be tired together. Izuku sat near the back of the cabin with Kendo beside him, her head resting against his shoulder in a gesture of simple uncomplicated trust that required no further explanation, and watched the rest of his class settle into their own configurations of post-crisis comfort. Pony curled against Komori with her eyes already closing, Shiozaki and Tokage still talking quietly with their hands still joined, Yanagi sitting with the particular stillness of someone whose interior processing was running at full capacity even while her body rested, Kodai beside her, present in the specific quiet way that asked for nothing and offered everything simply by being there. Vlad King moved through the cabin checking on each student individually, the specific careful attention of a teacher confirming, beyond the formal medical clearance, that his students were genuinely as steady as they appeared. He paused beside Izuku and Kendo, looking at them both with an expression that Izuku could not fully read but that seemed to contain something between professional satisfaction and a quieter, more personal warmth. You made the right call on the corridor, he said to Izuku. Going in first. It saved time we did not know we would need until the confrontation upstairs compressed our timeline. Thank you, Izuku said. It is not nothing, Vlad King continued, to lead a team the way you led tonight. Tactically, yes. But also in the way the team trusted your assessments without hesitation. That kind of trust does not build itself. It is built, deliberately, over time, by someone who has earned it consistently. He looked, briefly, at the rest of the cabin, at the specific warm tangle of a class that had clearly built something considerable together. Whatever you have all built here, this year. It held tonight. That is the only test that actually matters. He moved on, continuing his check of the rest of the cabin, and Izuku sat with what he had said, the specific weight of it settling alongside the exhaustion and the relief and the lingering adrenaline that had not yet fully released from his system. He's right, Kendo said quietly, not lifting her head from his shoulder. It held. I knew it would, Izuku said. I think I knew it the whole time we were in there. Not because I wasn't afraid. I was afraid the entire time. But underneath the fear there was this, I don't know how to describe it precisely, this complete confidence that everyone would do exactly what they said they would do, because 8 months had taught me that this class simply does not fail each other. Not in the small things and not in the large ones. That's what you built, Kendo said. What we all built. Together. I think it's what you all already were, he said. I just got to be part of it at the right time. She lifted her head finally and looked at him in the dim cabin light, the floodlights of the receding industrial district giving way, outside the window, to the quieter darkness of the highway back toward UA. Both things are true, she said. We were already this. And you made us more of it. I don't think those are in competition. I think that's just what happens when the right person joins something that was already good. It gets better, not because the original thing was deficient, but because growth is always possible when the new addition is genuine. He thought about Komori's mycelial network theory, about nodes and connections and the density of trust that had built, person by person, across 8 months, and understood, sitting in the dim transport cabin with his class resting around him and Kendo's hand back in his, that tonight had been the proof the theory had been waiting for. The network had been tested under real pressure, the kind of pressure that revealed exactly what a system was actually made of rather than what it merely claimed to be, and it had held, completely, in every single connection, because every single connection had been built honestly from the very beginning. The transport carried them home through the last hour before midnight, and Class 1B arrived back at UA tired and whole and entirely, completely, theirs, a team that had been built across a school year of patient honest attention and that had now been tested, and proven, in exactly the way that mattered most. Chapter 50, What the Night Taught Them. The days following the Tatara incident carried the specific quality that follows any genuine crisis successfully survived, a heightened appreciation for the ordinary that made even routine training sessions and standard classroom hours feel, briefly, more vivid than they had felt before, the particular gratitude of people who have been reminded, sharply and without warning, exactly how much they have to lose and exactly how much they value not losing it. Izuku spent the Monday after the incident in the standard debrief sessions that pro-hero deployments required, sitting through detailed tactical reviews with Vlad King and the responding pro-heroes, contributing his own analysis of the maintenance corridor assessment and the extraction sequencing with the specific clear-headed focus that came easily now. The adrenaline long since processed and replaced by the steady useful clarity of someone reviewing work they were genuinely proud of. The review confirmed what he had already understood intuitively in the moment, that the extraction team's performance had been, in the specific technical language the pro-heroes used, exemplary, the kind of clean efficient execution that came only from teams who had trained together long enough to operate as a single coordinated unit rather than a collection of individually skilled people forced into temporary cooperation. Your structural assessment in the corridor likely saved real time, Ed Schott told him directly, during the formal debrief, with the specific economical praise of a pro-hero who did not waste words on flattery and meant precisely what he said. And the lattice reinforcement, the chemical stabilization, the hostage management, all of it moved with a coordination I don't often see even among experienced team units. Whoever built this class built something genuinely good. Izuku thought, hearing this, of 8 months of bento boxes and 47-page nutritional documents and language exchange sessions at 7 in the morning and mushroom theories about mycelial networks and quiet conversations in winter gardens, all of it converging, in retrospect, into exactly the foundation that had held a chemical processing facility together under real pressure and brought 31 strangers home safely. We built it together, he said. All of us. I don't think any one person could take credit for it. Ed Schott looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested he understood considerably more than the simple words conveyed. That, he said, is usually exactly what the best teams say. And it is usually exactly true. The class gathered that evening in the common room, the full group together for the first time since the floodlit staging area, and the gathering had a quality that was different from the ordinary evenings that had built across the year, quieter in some ways and louder in others, the specific texture of a group processing something significant together rather than simply existing comfortably in shared space. Kendo stood, eventually, with the particular gravity she brought to moments that required her full presidential presence, and the room settled into attention without needing to be asked. I want to say something, she said, and I think it needs to be said out loud rather than just felt privately. She looked around the room, at each face in turn, the specific deliberate attention of someone making sure everyone understood they were included in what she was about to say. What we did Friday night was not luck. It was not even, primarily, talent, though all of us have talent. It was the direct result of 8 months of choosing, every single day, to actually know each other. To care about each other honestly instead of just efficiently. I do not think we would have moved the way we moved Friday night if we had spent this year as colleagues instead of as. She paused, searching for the word, and Izuku watched her find it. As family. That is what we have built. And Friday night proved that it is real, because it held under the only test that actually matters. The room was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a group absorbing something true and significant. To family, then, Tokage said, raising the mug of tea she had been holding, the gesture half serious and entirely sincere in the particular way that Tokage managed to combine those two qualities better than almost anyone Izuku had ever known. The room responded with the warm scattered agreement of people who meant the toast completely despite its informality, mugs and water bottles raised across the common room in the specific gesture of a group acknowledging, together, what they had become. Izuku raised his own mug and looked around the room at the people who had, across 8 months, become exactly what Kendo had named, and felt the specific warm certainty that comes from having something proven true under the highest possible stakes rather than simply believed true in comfortable circumstances. He thought about October, about standing outside the classroom door and counting to 23 before he had the courage to knock, about the version of himself who had not known, walking into that room for the first time, that he was walking into the family Kendo had just named in front of all of them. He was glad, more than he had words for, that he had knocked. The evening continued in the warm ordinary way that evenings in Class 1B's common room had always continued, but underneath the ordinary warmth now sat the specific unshakable knowledge that the warmth was not fragile, that it had been tested in the way that mattered most and had held completely, and that whatever came next, in the remaining months of the school year and beyond it, this class would meet it the same way they had met Friday night, together, honestly, and without hesitation. The King's Inheritance. A My Hero Academia fan series. Act 7, The Last Weeks of the Year. Chapter 51, The Last Weeks of the Year. The weeks following the Tatara incident moved with the specific accelerated quality that final stretches of a school year always carry, the calendar suddenly dense with the accumulated obligations that had been postponed across a long busy term, final assessments and end-of-year evaluations and the particular administrative momentum of an institution preparing to close one chapter cleanly before opening the next. Izuku moved through these weeks with the settled clarity that the crisis had, in its own difficult way, given him the specific confirmation that everything he had built across the year, the careful honest attention and the patient accumulated trust, was not a fragile thing that needed protecting from reality but a genuinely sturdy thing that reality itself had already tested and found sound. Class 1B's final assessment cycle in early June carried a different character than the assessments that had come before it, not because the material was harder, though it was, second-year curriculum building meaningfully on everything the first year had established, but because the class approaching it together no longer carried the underlying uncertainty that had shaded even the most successful earlier assessments, the quiet question of whether they were truly as strong together as they hoped. A question the chemical processing facility had answered definitively enough that nobody needed to ask it again. The study group met through these final weeks with the same Thursday evening rhythm that had defined it since October, though the rhythm now carried a specific bittersweet quality, the awareness that this particular configuration of evenings, this exact group of people gathered around this exact table with this exact pot of tea, existed inside a school year that was, undeniably, ending. Izuku found himself, during the final session before the assessment, looking around the table with the same careful attention he had given the room on his very first day, except that where the October version of that attention had been cataloging, the June version was something closer to treasuring. The deliberate effort to hold a moment fully in awareness because some part of him already understood that moments this complete did not arrive often and deserved, when they did arrive, to be noticed rather than simply lived through. Kendo caught him at it, as she so often did. "You're doing the thing," she said. "The looking Gatevarion thing." "I am," he admitted. "I think I'm trying to remember this exactly as it is." "It's not going anywhere," she said. "This isn't ending. The school year is ending. We are not." He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "I know," he said. "I think I'm still letting myself believe that completely. The believing is easier than it used to be. But I think some part of me is always going to want to hold on to good things a little harder than is strictly necessary, because I spent a long time believing good things were rarer than they actually are." Kendo reached over and put her hand briefly over his on the table, a small gesture that required no further words, and the study group continued around them in its familiar warm texture, Tokage debating a tactical scenario with Yanagi, Pony, and Komori comparing notes on a Japanese literature passage, Shiozaki reading aloud a particularly clear articulation of an ethical principle and asking the table whether they found it as clarifying as she did, Kodai sorting her index cards with the same quiet efficient focus she had always brought to everything. The assessment came and went, and Class 1B performed, in the specific technical language the faculty used, exceptionally, each individual contribution elevated by the collective foundation the year had built, and Vlad King's debrief carried, underneath its professional structure, the specific quiet pride of a teacher watching a class become exactly what he had hoped, across a long demanding year, it might become. Chapter 52, The Last Training Session. The final full class training session of the first year fell on the third Saturday of June, a deliberately structured exercise that Vlad King had designed not as an assessment but as a kind of culmination, a session intended simply to let the class demonstrate, for its own satisfaction rather than for any evaluative purpose, exactly how far they had traveled since the tentative uncertain exercises of the previous autumn. Izuku stood at the edge of the east training field in the bright June morning, the same field where he had once watched Shota and Shiozaki's coordinated timing protocol with the analytical fascination of an outsider studying a system he hoped to understand, and felt the specific full-circle quality of standing in that exact spot now as someone who was not studying the system from outside but who had become, over 8 months, one of its load-bearing connections. The exercise Vlad King had designed required the full class to coordinate a complex multistage rescue and containment scenario considerably more demanding than anything they had attempted even during the joint exercises of the autumn, deliberately calibrated to require every single member of the class operating at their full capability and trusting every other member to do the same. They moved through it with a fluency that made the exercise's considerable difficulty almost invisible from the observation platform. The specific quality of a team operating so far beyond the need for conscious coordination that the coordination itself had become instinct, Kendo's command structure flowing seamlessly into Tokage's improvisational adjustments, Yanagi and Kodai's precision work integrating perfectly with Shiozaki's structural support, Komori and Pony covering ground that the original plan had not specifically assigned them simply because they had each independently recognized, in the moment, exactly where their particular capabilities were most needed. Izuku moved through his own portion of the exercise with the settled confident clarity that 8 months and one genuine crisis had built into him, no longer the careful analytical newcomer cataloging unfamiliar patterns but a fully integrated part of a system he understood completely, in the bones rather than only in the notebooks. When the exercise concluded, Vlad King's debrief was, for him, uncharacteristically brief. "I don't have much to add," he said, looking at the assembled class with an expression that combined his usual professional reserve with something warmer underneath it. "You know what you did well. You know what you can still improve. I trust you to know the difference without me spelling it out, because you have spent a year proving exactly that capacity to me, over and over, in increasingly difficult circumstances." He paused. "I am proud of all of you. I don't say that often, because I don't think it should be said often, but today, at the end of this particular year, it needs saying clearly. I am proud of you." The class received this with the specific quiet weight that simple sincere praise carries when it comes from someone who has earned, through months of rigorous honest investment, the right to give it meaningfully. Afterward, in the cool-down period that the June morning made considerably more pleasant than the cold mornings of the autumn and winter had been, Izuku found himself standing at the low wall at the field's edge, the same wall where he had sat with Tokage back in March processing the strange new size of everything that had been happening to him, and looked out at his class scattered across the field in the bright morning light, each of them distinct and known and, in the specific accumulated way that a full year had built, completely his in the sense that mattered most, not possessed but belonged to, mutually and completely, the way that family belongs to itself. He thought about October, about counting to 23 outside a classroom door, about a year that had asked him to be brave in ways he had not anticipated and had given him, in return, considerably more than he had thought himself capable of receiving. Chapter 53, 17 Conversations, 1 year later. In the final week before the summer recess, Izuku found himself returning, in quiet moments, to the notebook page he had written back in late April, the private ledger holding 17 names and 17 words, each one capturing as accurately as language allowed the specific shape of what he felt for each person in his class. He had not added to that page since April. He found, looking at it now in the last week of June, that he did not need to add to it, because the words he had chosen back then had held, completely, across 2 more months that had included a genuine crisis and the full weight of real danger and the specific test that had revealed, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly how sound the foundation underneath those words actually was. What had changed, he understood, was not the shape of what he felt for each of them but the depth of his confidence in it, the difference between believing something was true and having watched it proven true under circumstances that left no room for comfortable illusion. He spent an evening in that final week walking through the dorm, finding each of them in turn, not for any formal conversation, the formal conversations belonged to the autumn and winter that had built this, but for the smaller quieter acknowledgments that a year's ending seemed to call for. He found Kendo in the common room, finishing her final class president duties for the term with the same careful thoroughness she brought to everything, and sat with her for 20 minutes simply existing in comfortable shared quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer needed filling because the trust underneath it had long since stopped requiring proof. He found Yanagi in the library at her usual corner table, and she looked up at his approach with the specific recognition that had stopped surprising him months ago, and they sat together while she finished her reading and he finished his notes, the companionship requiring nothing beyond its own quiet presence. He found Tokage in the common room kitchen, making the specific tea she had learned, across the year, was his favorite, and she handed him a mug without being asked and said, 1 year, with the simple satisfaction of someone marking a milestone she had been quietly anticipating. 1 year, he agreed. He found Pony in the second-floor lounge, reviewing her English notes one final time before the recess, and she greeted him in both languages, as she always did for things that mattered, and told him she had been thinking about how much had changed since the cold October mornings when they had first started meeting there. He found Komori in the garden behind the dormitory, examining a new growth she had spotted near the hedge line, and she pulled him down to look at it with her, explaining its biology with the same warm enthusiasm she had always brought to every discovery, and he listened with the same genuine fascination he had always given her, and thought that some things, the truest things, simply did not need to change to remain exactly as valuable as they had always been. He found Shiozaki in the winter garden, which was, in June, simply the garden, the glass walls now letting in the full warmth of summer rather than providing shelter from winter cold, and she told him that the structure she had built, internally, since their conversation there in December, had held completely through everything the year had asked of it. He found Kodai on the window seat at the end of the second-floor corridor, sorting through a final set of index cards, and she said, when he sat beside her, "Good year," with the specific economy that, from her, contained an entire speech's worth of meaning. He found, in turn, everyone else, Fukudashi and Ren and Hananuki and Shota and Awaze and Kaibara and Shishida and Tsuburaba, each conversation brief and warm and specific to exactly who they were, and by the time the evening had fully settled into night, he had touched, in some small way, every single connection that the year had built, and felt, walking back to his own room in the warm June dark, the specific complete satisfaction of someone who has tended carefully to everything that matters to him and found it all, without exception, exactly as sound as he had hoped. Chapter 54, What the Network Had Become. On the final evening before the summer recess began, Class 1B gathered in the common room one more time, the full group together in the specific configuration that had become, across the year, their truest form, 21 people who had arrived as strangers organized by administrative necessity and had become, through the patient accumulated work of genuine attention, something considerably larger than the sum of their individual parts. Komori had brought out her mycelial network theory one final time, sketching it on a spare piece of paper for anyone who had not heard the full explanation before, the nodes and connections and the particular resilience that distributed strength provided, and the class had listened with the specific warm amusement of people who recognized, in the biological metaphor, an accurate description of something they had all, individually, come to understand about themselves and each other across the year. We started as 20 individual nodes, Komori said, finishing her sketch with a final flourish. A class assigned by a sorting algorithm, basically. We are ending the year as something the sorting algorithm could never have predicted. A network so dense that losing any single connection would not break us, because every connection reinforces every other one. You're describing family again, Tokage said, just with more biology. Family is biology, Komori said, with the serene confidence of someone who had arrived at a worldview through careful observation and found it consistently validated. Just not always the kind you're born into. Kendo stood, in the particular way she stood when something needed to be marked formally, and the room settled into its familiar attentive quiet. I want to say something about this year, she said. Not the speech I gave after Tatara. Something different. A closing thought, I suppose, since we're closing the year. She looked around the room, at each face, the same deliberate inclusive attention she had always brought to her role and that had, across the year, become something considerably more personal than the role required. When Midoriya transferred in October, I remember thinking that we were getting an exceptional addition to the class. I was right about that. I did not anticipate that we were also getting someone who would teach all of us, in his own quiet thorough way, how much more we were capable of feeling for each other than we had previously let ourselves feel. She paused, and the room held its quiet, waiting. I don't think that's a small thing, she continued. I think most people go through entire lives without ever experiencing what this class built this year. Not because it isn't possible for them. Because it requires a specific kind of bravery that most environments don't encourage, the bravery of being honestly known by more than one person at a time, of believing that love is not a scarce resource that has to be rationed and protected, but something that multiplies the more honestly it is shared. She looked, briefly, at Izuku, with an expression of complete warm gratitude. I think we learned that bravery this year. All of us, together. And I think it is the single most valuable thing any of us is taking away from this first year at UA, more valuable, even, than anything we learned in the classroom or the training field. Izuku felt the weight of this land in his chest with the specific full quality of something true being spoken aloud in a room full of people who all, individually, recognized its truth. To the network, Yanagi said, raising her tea with the precise simple gesture that, from her, carried as much sincerity as any longer toast could have managed. To the network, the room echoed, mugs and cups raised together in the warm common room light, and Izuku raised his own and looked around at the people who had, across one extraordinary year, become exactly what Kendo had named, and felt, completely and without reservation, that he had found, in the most unexpected way imaginable, exactly the thing he had spent his whole life not knowing he was searching for. Chapter 55, Epilogue, the second year begins. The summer recess passed the way good summers pass, quickly and warmly, filled with the small accumulated contact that kept a network alive across a season of physical distance, messages, and calls and the occasional visit, Kendo spending a week at his mother's insistence joining them for dinner during a visit to the area. Komori sending him photographs of an entire summer's worth of fungal specimens with the same enthusiastic annotation she always brought to her discoveries, Pony's voice. Messages continuing in their familiar mixture of English and Japanese, each one a small thread keeping the larger fabric from fraying during the months apart. He returned to UA for the second year on a bright morning in early September, walking through the same gates he had first walked through nearly 2 years earlier as a nervous quirkless boy who had not yet known whether he would ever be allowed to call himself a hero, and felt, crossing the threshold this time, the specific settled confidence of someone returning to exactly the place he belonged. Class 1B's second-year classroom was the same room, the same desks, the same window with the same view of the training fields beyond, but it held, now, a different quality entirely, the accumulated warmth of a full year's history rather than the careful uncertain potential of a beginning. He took his seat, the same seat that had once been Tetsu's and that the universe, Tokage had once told him, had been waiting to fill correctly, and looked around the room at the faces that greeted him, no longer unfamiliar blanks waiting to be filed into a notebook but a network of people fully known and fully knowing him in return, each connection tested and proven and stronger, after everything the first year had asked of them, than any of them could have predicted on that uncertain October morning so long ago. Kendo caught his eye from her seat near the front, the small direct smile that had become, across the year, one of the most familiar and most treasured expressions in his entire daily experience. Tokage gave him the raised eyebrow that had, by now, become a complete sentence between them, checking on the state of something she had been invested in since the very beginning, and he gave her the small nod that confirmed, as it always did, that everything remained exactly as it should be. Vlad King entered the room with the same brisk professional energy he always brought to the start of a term, and looked at his assembled class with an expression that Izuku had come to recognize, across the year, as the particular satisfaction of a teacher watching something he had helped build continue exactly as it should. "Welcome back," he said. "Second year. Higher stakes, harder work, and considerably less patience from me for excuses, since I know exactly what all of you are actually capable of now. A pause, and something almost like warmth crossed his usually reserved expression. I am glad to have all of you back. Let's make this year count. The class settled into its familiar rhythm with the ease of a system long since proven sound, and Izuku opened a fresh notebook. The first page of a second year that he understood, now, would be built on a foundation that had already survived everything that could reasonably be asked of it. He wrote, at the top of the page, the same words he had written at the top of his very first page in this class, nearly a year ago, Class 1B. But where the October version of those words had been followed by blanks, by names waiting to resolve into people he did not yet know, the September version needed no blanks at all. He knew every name. He knew every person behind every name, completely and honestly, in the specific deep way that only a year of patient genuine attention could build. He closed the notebook. He looked around the room one more time, at Kendo, and Tokage and Yanagi and Pony and Komori and Shiozaki and Kodai and Fukudashi and all the rest, the whole network gathered together at the start of something new that was, in its truest sense, simply the continuation of something that had already proven, beyond any remaining doubt, that it was built to last. Outside the window, the September morning was bright and full of beginning, and inside the room, 21 people who had become, across one extraordinary year, exactly what family means, settled into their seats and prepared, together, for whatever the second year would ask of them. Whatever it asked, Izuku understood completely. They would meet it the same way they had met everything since that cold October morning when a quirkless boy turned hero had walked through an unfamiliar door and found, waiting on the other side, considerably more than he had ever let himself hope for. They would meet it together. They always had. They always would.